Well, welcome everybody to ADA Compliance and Website Accessibility. It's a joint webinar today from SilverTech, digital marketing and technology company, creating valuable digital experiences across a variety of industries, and Pannos Marketing, a full-service communications firm specializing in strategic marketing, PR, social media, e-commerce, and website solutions for financial institutions. And thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm your host, Ian Hughes, content strategist here at SilverTech. And now I'm going to slide back out of view and introduce our panelists for today. First, from SilverTech, let me introduce Paul Cream. Paul is our Vice President General Counsel of SilverTech. With over 30 years of experience practicing law, Paul works with senior leadership to ensure that SilverTech is consistently pursuing strategic goals, as well as providing day-to-day contract review. Welcome, Paul.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. And we have Rafael Verana, our UI UX designer at SilverTech. Raf is a UI UX designer with over 4 years of experience exploring and applying accessibility standards in design and development, and recently announced as a featured speaker on this topic at UX Burlington. Congratulations, Raf, and welcome today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Then from Pannos Marketing, we're joined by Amanda Rowe, Senior VP of Delivery at Pannos Marketing. Now, for the last 5 years, Amanda has been an influential leader at the agency. Amanda's graphic design background and depth of experience in marketing and media has helped her to implement a strategic oversight, which has been essential to ensuring our clients have access to high-powered integrating marketing solutions. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Good morning.
And we have Tracy Marson, Web Operations Manager from Pannos Marketing. Tracy is our in-house ADA expert with 13 years of experience developing and managing web operations, helping to ensure our clients have modern, responsive, and compliant websites. Welcome, Tracy.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Very excited to discuss this hot topic today. So on the agenda, first we're going to discuss a brief history of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's the ADA, of course. The ADA, website accessibility, and some lessons from recent cases. We'll dive into the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And we will then conclude with a Q&A. Now, I mentioned WCAG before we go too far. I myself say WCAG, but you may also hear it said as WCAG, WCAG. Any other terms, Raf, Tracy, you've heard out there?
Yeah, personally, I refer to it as WCAG.
Okay. Excellent. So let's dive into a brief history of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So again, we're here today to discuss the ADA and website accessibility. But first, let's more generally begin with an introduction to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Signed into law in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, it gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities, similar to those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. Importantly, it is a civil rights law. It guarantees equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in public accommodations, employment transportation, state and local government services, and telecommunications. Paul, essentially the purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And again, I think it is just good business for any company to allow access to as many people as possible to their goods and services. And a lot of people, for that would be their website. So in my mind, it's the same thing as accessibility to a building if you were a bricks and mortar business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent point, and one that we will elaborate on throughout this presentation today. In 2018, it's expected that the Department of Justice will issue regulations regarding website accessibility. More on that too in a little bit. So to add further clarity, the U.S. Attorney General signed the ADA Amendments Act final rule with an effective date of October 11, 2016. In summary, the ADA Amendment Act is intended to broaden the definition of disability. Paul, what does it mean for ADA cases that the question of whether an individual's impairment is a disability under the ADA should not demand extensive analysis?
Well, the amendment was a reaction to recent cases. They had narrowed the definition of disability.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is it's essential for any business to basically be as accessible as possible.
Right. And the definition of disability now has been expanded to include physical and mental impairments. So the term is now illustrated with additional examples of dyslexia, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. So it's a larger group of people that fall under this umbrella now.
That's correct.
I think the key takeaway then is the person making a claim may not have to carry as heavy a burden to prove their claim. So who's covered by the ADA? In short, businesses covered by the ADA are Title I, that's equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities, so that's private employers with 15 or more employees. Title II covers non-discrimination on the basis of disability in state and local government. Public entities at state and local levels, which include both physical and programmatic access to all programs and services offered. And then there's Title III. That's non-discrimination on the basis of disability by public accommodations and in commercial facilities. That's businesses operating for the benefit of public and nonprofits. So in regard to website accessibility, the Department of Justice had promised guidelines in 2016, but focused first on those entities covered under Title II, public entities at state and local levels. Amanda, despite there being no formal guidelines in place just yet, what do you recommend to organizations that may be assessing the accessibility of their web presence?
Well, I recommend that they do think about ADA and they think about the implications for their website and for their business. And in the lack of formal guidance right now, many people are looking at the WCAG 2.0 level AA as sort of the baseline for what you should be attempting to achieve to be compliant.
Very nice. We have a couple examples of cases that will lead us to that, I think, that same conclusion that WCAG level AA is the way to go to ensure compliance. So let's move on to some of those recent cases, the ADA, website accessibility, and lessons from recent cases. Here are excerpts from a statement from the US Department of Justice, fall 2015. The ADA's expansive non-discrimination mandate reaches the goods and services provided by public accommodations using internet websites. The inability to access websites put individuals at a great disadvantage in today's society, which is driven by a dynamic electronic marketplace and unprecedented access to information. Paul, I think this is a telling part of the statement. Beyond goods and services, information available on the internet has become a gateway to education, socialization, and entertainment. Your thoughts?
Well, I think for the most part, the targeted sites, at least at the beginning, have been what I guess I would call transactional sites, places where people are either transacting payments, looking for doctors, say a hospital website, and again, banking and credit unions, processing payments, depositing checks, moving money around in their accounts. Again, a lot of people don't even go to bank locations anymore. They do all their banking through the internet. A third potential target is educational services, companies or universities and colleges that are providing educational content through their websites. And again, it needs to be accessible because people are using those sites to actually gain the same information that other people would be using.
Briefly, I'd like to touch upon Section 508 amendment. This is to the Rehabilitation Act 1973. Now, Section 508 was enacted to eliminate barriers in information technology, to make available new opportunities for people with disabilities, and to encourage development of technologies that will help achieve these goals. Now, there's nothing in Section 508 that requires private websites to comply unless they're receiving federal funds or under contract with a federal agency, but it does point us toward what may be commercial best practices, as Amanda had mentioned earlier, and that is those guidelines such as from the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI. So guidance is due in 2018 for private websites covered under Title III. In the meantime, Paul, we're seeing website ADA compliance being enforced on a case-by-case basis. Could you tell us a little more about what you're seeing?
Well, the problem with case-by-case basis and the concept of each individual state having to deal with it is, again, no uniform guidelines. And again, I think there's been particular states that seem to have been targeted based on the fact that there might be an individual law firm that is an advocate for disabilities or advocacy groups that are targeting. And right now we've seen a lot and Amanda can probably add to it, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, mid-Atlantic states, but I don't think that means that's where it's going to stop.
Right.
I just think that's where we're seeing a lot of activity at the beginning anyway.
Amanda, could you tell us a bit what you're seeing and any clients that you've been working with that have received demand letters?
Sure. So we have had a couple of clients that have received demand letters. In one case, it was in that Pennsylvania mid-Atlantic region, and in another case, actually out in Illinois, from a new law firm that seemed to have cropped up that's based out of California. And we've had clients take a couple of approaches. The client out in Illinois was well on their way towards relaunching a new website that would be ADA compliant. They still got a little nervous and wanted to make some immediate changes just to protect themselves. So we did some minor updates to their existing site, knowing that in 8 weeks they would be newly launched with a fully ADA compliant website. We had another client that took the approach of basically going back to the law firm and saying, no, we're not
Right.
really going to engage with this. And, what will your next steps be if we say no to you? And the law firm basically said, we'll just go on to the next one. So I don't know what Paul's take on that approach is, but it's, really just a matter of the institution and how risk averse they are and how they want to handle it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting point there. I think we will, I hope that we will conclude by the end of the presentation that it's making your site accessible is really a best practice anyway. And, you should move forward in that regard. But it's interesting to point out those two approaches in dealing with demand letters that may be coming more and more often. So I think the key takeaway then is that it is a certainty that at some point you may want to make your website ADA compliant. Amanda, care to comment on this takeaway? Should that certainty be sooner rather than later?
Sure. So I think we sort of just touched on this.
Mm-hmm.
It is a factor of how risk averse you are.
Right.
If you're tend to be a little more conservative, you might want to take steps sooner. If you aren't quite as concerned, you can probably wait a little bit. But we've also talked about that being ADA compliant goes hand in hand with some best practices regarding SEO and some other usability issues. So, there's a couple of things to look at. Being ADA compliant is important, and also having a great new website with the latest and greatest features and SEO and usability is also very important, and luckily they work together.
They do work hand in hand. Yes. So I think, I imagine anyone starting a web project in 2018 would likely have to have accessibility in mind.
I would hope so.
Yes.
I think it goes along with being, mobile responsive and all those other things you would expect in 2018.
Absolutely.
At least hopefully.
Yes. Let's touch upon the first of our cases then. This is the National Federation of the Blind versus Target Corporation. Now, I won't dive too deep into the specifics of each of these cases. I've just chosen a few that may give us some insight into what guidance may eventually be. So Target argued that their website was not a place of public accommodation. However, the court found it is clear that the purpose of the statute is broader than mere physical access, seeking to bar actions or omissions which impair a disabled person's full enjoyment of services or goods of a covered accommodation. Paul, the key takeaway here is that a website may be considered a place of public accommodation.
That's true. I think any company, and I think we've already said it a couple of times, which is, I think you need to think of your website just as you would your front door to your business.
Sure.
And the fact that you may or may not have a physical location doesn't change the fact that that's the front door of your business. It's the portal in which people are going to enter and conduct business with you.
And Amanda, you work at Pannos Marketing, you work with banks and credit unions. How important is that web presence to them?
It's very important. Your website is most likely your busiest branch when you're looking at a financial institution. And you wouldn't want to have someone not be able to walk in off the street and access your branch. So you don't want to make your website so that it's inaccessible to them either. Both to existing members and customers, and also potential members and customers. If they can't engage with your business online, they may choose not to engage with your business at all.
Very good point. We can move on to the Department of Justice peapod.com settlement. So this settlement shows that the Department of Justice is looking closely at the accessibility of websites and mobile apps and remains aggressive in its enforcement efforts. And in this case too, we did get some indication as to where the Department of Justice may head with eventual guidance. The Department of Justice may require companies to comply with WCAG 2.0 level AA standards, which we will dive further into a little later. But I'd like now to introduce the perspectives of our design and development experts, Tracy and Raf. Raf, could you speak to a moment about the idea of mobile-first design and how that may help in building an accessible website?
Yeah, so designing for mobile first is the idea that you start with a smaller screen and limited functionality, and you tackle that approach first, and then you expand upon desktop sizes design-wise. When you do that, when you consider those things first, they inherently carry over to be more accessible, because you have things like larger buttons, maybe more streamlined accessibility, more obvious navigation. So the two kind of go hand in hand, or at least are conducive to being more readable, being just overall easier to use if you do mobile first.
Right, makes sense. I think if you're looking at that canvas of a desktop site, you just want to fill in, lots of information here, buttons here, things flashing over in the corner.
Yeah, it removes
start with the minimal, experience first and work up. I think you'll find that it's cleaner, it's more accessible.
Exactly.
Generally.
Yeah, more clutter-free.
Now, the last case that we'll take a quick look at is one currently working its way through the federal district court, and that's here in New Hampshire. It shares many similarities with the cases we've already mentioned. In fact, in the memorandum order, this Netflix case is cited. This is Access Now Incorporated, which serves several plaintiffs who are blind, versus Blue Apron, and this is the ingredient and recipe meal kit service. We actually obtained a full copy of the memorandum order ahead of today's presentation, and reading through it, I was struck by the following. It stated, Title III, which prescribes disability-based discrimination that prevents the full and equal enjoyment of goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodation of any place of public accommodation. Plaintiffs allege that Blue Apron violates Title III by not making its website sufficiently accessible to blind and visually impaired customers. The website is not compatible with screen readers and is largely unusable due to various accessibility barriers. Here's the judge's conclusion. For the reasons discussed therein, the court denies the defendant's motion to dismiss the complaint. Paul, do you think we're going to see more of this, cases like this moving through the district courts, even without this guidance from the Department of Justice?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think we're going to see any guidance from the Department of Justice anytime soon.
No.
And secondly, yes, I do think we're going to see more cases. And New Hampshire came down on the majority side in this district anyway, in terms of, first of all, allowing the case to go forward, and secondly, the holding that they had, which was the site has to be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they dealt with the mobile access as well, which I think also gives additional guidance. So I think the district court in the first district, which is New Hampshire and the New England states, is basically gone with the majority of the rest of the country. And I think that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to see a lot of cases survive summary judgment, motions to dismiss. I don't think you're going to see, and I think more and more cases are going to continue going forward.
They will, yes. And as you alluded to, the Department of Justice likely doesn't have it on its priorities for 2018 like they may have had a year or two ago. They're busy with other matters at this time. But without that guidance, what we are seeing is each of these cases that moves forward gives us another clue as to what eventual guidance might be.
Well, I think the irony is going to be, although there might be a case-by-case approach,
Mm-hmm.
I think we're starting to see some uniformity among the district courts in terms of what they're holding as a standard.
Interesting. There was another interesting aspect to this court case too. I'd like to turn to you, Tracy. The plaintiffs here are blind and couldn't access the website. They were using a screen reader. Could you tell us what a screen reader is and how it would access a site like Blue Aprons?
Sure. So users using a screen reader device basically tab through a website and it reads off capabilities of the website.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this particular scenario where they're being barricaded is probably due to functionality where keyboard functionality has not been tapped into the website.
Okay.
So it's only accessible via like a click of mouse, and so they're unable to access pretty much the majority of the website.
Okay, so the screen reader itself is looking for some cues to know where it's to go to next, and those apparently were not there on this Blue Apron site.
Yes, and so what can happen in most cases, they'll skip over large chunks of content, not being able to get into like drop-down menus or sliders in various parts of functions.
Things that I imagine would have been on the forms to set up your orders to actually enjoy this service.
Right, versus where we can see, we'd be able to look at the screen and know exactly what to do.
Mm-hmm.
The screen reader has no instruction and basically cannot carry out any of the functions on the website.
Interesting. We'll discuss a few other devices used to access sites a little later. Let's just conclude this section of the presentation. These recent cases may only be the beginning of the explosion of website accessibility cases. As Paul mentioned, some courts may be increasingly reluctant to dismiss website accessibility lawsuits at the beginning of the case. Cases will continue to discovery, and this will cause the defendant companies to incur potentially substantial costs of defense, even if the defendants ultimately prevail on the merits. Amanda, I think Paul has made a strong legal argument for making your website accessible, and beyond being legally compelled to do so, you've touched upon it, but what are those other reasons for making an accessible website?
Sure. So, and I did touch upon this. You don't want to block a member or a customer from accessing your website or being able to log into online banking,
Mm-hmm.
apply for a new account or a loan online. You want them to be able to do all of the things online, regardless of their abilities or what they might use for an assistive device as all of your other members and customers. So from just a customer and member services perspective, having a site that's compliant makes a lot of sense. And along with that, it means that you have a nice mobile responsive site.
Mhm.
You have enhanced SEO. You have, an updated look. So there's a lot of sort of visual components to it that make sense, but just from purely a customer service perspective, you're granting that access to everybody equally.
Accessibility really overlaps with this optimal customer experience.
Exactly.
In our next section now, World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we're going to dive into some of those WCAG level AA guidelines we've been alluding to. And I think this is where we'll gain an understanding as to what guidance may ultimately be, or it at least shows us where we should be heading to in 2018. Leading the web to its full potential. And this is the tagline for the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. It was founded in 1994 by Tim Berners-Lee, who is often credited as one of the founders of the World Wide Web. Raf, you're a strong advocate for accessibility. Your thoughts? I mean, since the beginning, the internet has been about being accessible.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, as the point of the internet is to distribute and provide access to information, right? So that people from all over the globe can be connected. So as we've mentioned before, the internet is primary place of business, even for people that are able to interact with it in different ways. So it's pretty crucial that it's just accessible for just about anyone, because why would you want to bar someone? Why would you want to hold back your business?
And I think too, a point is that, somebody who has a disability and has, problems that interacting in the real world and barred from doing certain things in the physical world, the internet, the web, it can be built easily enough to allow those people to have full access to all of the entertainment, all of the socialization, all of the commerce on the internet. So I think almost in not having an accessible site, you're working against the true purpose of why we're all connecting.
Exactly.
Online.
And another thing too is that a lot of materials now, as we're used to the digital age, are purely online. Presentations, maybe training manuals, videos, PDFs, things like that.
Webinars on ADA compliance.
There you go. So, if your site's not accessible, there's just absolutely no other way for someone who's differently able to access that information at all. They don't have the option of going to a brick and mortar store or anything like that. So,
very interesting. Good point. So in 1999, the Web Accessibility Initiative, this is WAI, and the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. In 2008, these standards were updated into WCAG 2.0, and this has become an ISO international standard for the web. A number of governments already require that public websites meet these standards, including those in the EU and Australia. And as we saw from the Peapod case, the Department of Justice may make WCAG level AA compliance the new standard. So WCAG 2.0 established 4 principles, POUR, for which there are 3 levels, A, AA, AAA. And let's review the principles first. P is for perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. You must provide text alternatives for non-text content. You must provide captions and other alternatives for multimedia. You must create content that can be presented in different ways, including by assistive technologies, as Tracy mentioned earlier, without losing meaning. And you must make it easier for users to see and hear content. Generally, Raf, what considerations do you take in the design process to ensure that content will be perceivable later on?
Yeah, so as I begin a design, I always start with a pre-existing understanding of WCAG. So I keep guidelines in mind, such as knowing that my colors need enough contrast if I'm working with brand colors. Text sizes need to be sufficient. Navigation has to be obvious. Can't have flashes or things like that. So these are things that I keep in mind as I go, but there's also tools if you don't, have everything memorized.
Right.
There are plugins for Photoshop and Sketch, like color blindness plugins, or different tools that you can use, like to check color contrast on images. So I work through those, and then I always make sure to present my designs for feedback, so I get a different opinion, and maybe someone can catch something that I may have missed. And that way, 2 different brains working together, we kind of help flesh out a design and make sure it's as accessible as we can.
Nice, collaborative approach.
Yeah.
Always the best way to go. O is for operable in POUR. And this is where user interface components and navigation must be operable. So you must make all functionality available from a keyboard. You must give users enough time to read and use content. Do not use content that causes seizures. You You must help users navigate and find content. And then Tracy, what considerations do you take in the development phase of a web project to ensure that the final product is operable?
So it usually starts with the design phase.
Mhm.
So all the functionality would be kind of planned out before. So we would get a list of all the functions that are on the website. And then from that point, we kind of take into consideration all the keyboard keys that need to be pre-programmed into the website, and also instructions behind the scenes for a screen reader so they know how to use drop downs. Is it a matter of using specific letter keys, or is it a matter of tabbing into it, or is it a matter of using the arrow keys to scroll through different functionality? And then also too, we do a lot of user testing. Well, you know, if I program it, we also have another programmer on our team to kind of test it out to make sure it's actually operating appropriately.
Excellent. Good approach. And the U in POUR, that is for understandable. Information and the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. You must make text readable and understandable, make content appear and operate in predictable ways, help users avoid and correct mistakes. Amanda, the principle that you must make content appear and operate in predictable ways, it seems to cut into innovation a bit. What would you say to a client who may be considering something that is innovative for their site, but might not be considering the practicality or the accessibility of that feature?
Sure. So this does happen a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to still push for innovation. You know,
Of course.
there was a time when a hamburger menu might not have been something that everyone would recognize instantly, and now I think most people will. You know, so it's important to continue to push down that path, but then to tap into experts like Raphael and like Tracy to say, okay, this is what my vision is.
Yeah.
How do I make this work so that it's not going to cause problems for people who, you know, maybe can't look at things that are flashing or need to be able to have play pause controls on a video. So it's coming up with the idea and then sort of reining it in a little bit to just make sure that it won't cause problems for anybody.
Excellent, great approach. The R in POUR is for robust. Content must be robust enough so that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. In other words, don't use tags or code that only certain browsers understand. So you want to maximize compatibility with current and future user tools. Tracy, could you give us a brief description of some assistive technologies that users may be using to access a website? You talked screen readers. Are there others out there?
There are. So screen readers, I think everybody talks about screen readers, very well known. Another technology is the sip and puff technology. And those users are paralyzed, and so they interface with technology using a joystick with their mouth to navigate around websites. So I think it's really important, like Raph mentioned, to have a really simple user interface. So it's easier for these users to get to the content that they want to get to and not have to struggle through any of the functionality.
Now, is it an assistive technology like that, looking for similar cues in the development of the site that a screen reader is, anything in the back end that it's looking for, or does that technology give you essentially a mouse that you're controlling to access the site?
I believe, and Raph, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's essentially like a mouse, and so they're just basically scrolling around a website.
It is, yeah, but then the limitation is that it's harder. Obviously, there's limited mobility, and it's less reliable. You know, a click, you know exactly where it's going, whereas you know, you may have some motion while you're using the sip and puff. So that's why you still want to consider like larger buttons, simple navigation, so they don't have to, you know, scroll around before finding what they want.
Very good point. So for each of the WCAG 2.0 principles in POUR, there are guideline levels, A, AA, and AAA. Similar types of accessibility features are addressed in each, with AA having more and AAA having most criteria to meet that level of accessibility standard. Just for fun, Raph, how many websites out there do you think achieve AAA accessibility?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't have a number, but you know, the more complex a site is, obviously the smaller that chance becomes. It's harder to reach level AAA because the more, you know, functions and interactions you have, the more restrictions there are. So you have more to worry about. Basically, not many large sites out there can really reach AAA, and even WCAG itself has admitted that it's pretty strict, and it's something you should aspire to, but you know, you may not quite achieve it.
Yeah. So for example, in level AA, if you're broadcasting a video on your site, you have a video on your site, you must include captions, right, or a text alternative. In AAA, if that same video has to have, I believe, a live sign language interpreter.
Exactly. Yeah. So as you see, the restrictions are pretty. Yeah.
Good to
a lot
keep
more
in mind, though.
difficult to keep-
Yes, yeah. And again, too, there are items in level AA or AAA. I mean, if you don't have a video, you don't have to worry
Right,
about
it's not
those
your
things. So,
problem.
you know,
Yeah.
it may be easier to get AAA guidelines achieved if you just maybe have one line of large
Sure.
text on your
Yeah.
site. So, yeah, as I mentioned, businesses do not have to comply with all listed criteria to meet conformance, only those that apply to your website and your audience. So let's take a closer look at some of the items identified in WCAG 2.0 guideline level AA. So I'll go through some of the main items. Tracy and Raph are going to jump in and explain some. Audience on the line, if you have any questions as we go, please just drop the questions in the chat pane. And after we get through, we'll have time to discuss these items further if you would like to hear more. We will also follow up after the webinar with the presentation. So if you do want to get a look at the screen, you'll be able to see that. So here we go. Every image, video file, audio file, plugin, etc. has to have an alt tag. Raph, could you explain what an alt tag is and how important it is for accessibility?
Yeah, so an alt tag is alternative text that's attached to an image so that verbally you can describe what the image contains. So it's mainly used by screen readers so that obviously you can describe what's happening. And they're necessary because obviously non-sighted user is going to be missing out on potential content.
Mm-hmm.
So you need alt tags on images that actually pertain or provide information.
Okay.
If it's purely for decoration, like a background image with CSS or a graphic flourish of some sort, they don't need a filled out alt tag. It still needs, the attribute needs to be there in the HTML, but it needs to be left empty so that the screen reader or whatever user agent knows that it's not an error.
Okay, that's an important point. Then it doesn't need to be filled out, but it does need to be there.
Correct.
So that the screen reader knows
Yep.
that it's decorative. Complex graphics are accompanied by detailed text descriptions. Alt descriptions describe the purpose of objects. How descriptive do they need to be, Raph?
So they need to basically convey what someone would be missing out on if they couldn't see the image.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, if it's only decoration, then you don't have to worry about it. But if it's, for example, a graph, an infographic,
sure.
or
Yeah.
it alludes to, the text alludes to it,
Mm-hmm.
then you need to relay what that information is. You don't need to say, in your alt tag, you don't need to say this is an image of, etc. That's already taken care of by the screen reader. They would declare that if you're looking at an image, you simply need to say, for example, if you have an infographic, you would say this explains the content and so on.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Very good. If an image is also used as a link, make sure the alt tag describes the graphic and the link destination. Decorative graphics with no other function have empty alt descriptions, and that's the example Raph gave earlier. Then you want to add captions to videos, as we mentioned, add audio descriptions, create a link to the video rather than embedding it into your web pages. Tracy, why would you want to link to videos rather than embed them?
So as Raph kind of touched on earlier, there are a lot of points that you have to touch on if you embed them in the site.
Mm-hmm.
So by linking out to a video, you kind of bypass any of the WCAG guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you are required to provide a transcript, captioning, controls for the video.
Yep.
And then AAA goes on to having a sign language interpreter be active. So it's better to link out. Of course, it doesn't, from a user experience perspective, I think it's good to embed, but WCAG, you probably would be better off to link
unless
out.
you have the ability to add those captions and really own that video content. Correct. But if you have a YouTube video, probably better for you to put the burden on YouTube for that accessibility than yourself. So link over to your video there, unless you're prepared to add those accessibility features on the site.
Yeah. Because they already have, closed captions and
Yep.
play and stop buttons and everything like that. So why reinvent the wheel?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You want to add an additional link to a text transcript. Page should provide alternative links to the image map. Area tags must contain an alt attribute. Data tables have common and row headers are appropriately identified using the TH tag. Moving on, still talking about tables here. Tables used strictly for layout purposes do not have header rows or columns. Table cells are associated with the appropriate headers, e.g. the ID, header, scope, and or axis HTML attributes. Tracy, where do you see these types of table violations, and how do you build to prevent them?
So tables just by default are not responsive, so
Sure.
we generally don't use them, especially for layout purposes. We have
Mhm.
better technology now and frameworks that can offer better solutions. But typically where we see the violations, I usually see them with WYSIWYG editors, where if you're just using that, it misses headers and scope and columns, pieces that a screen reader will need to use to view and understand the content in that table.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there any reasons to use a table?
Yes. So if you're going to use a table, there is a time and place for tables. So I typically will tell clients, use it for data.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a rate table, if you've got, information that, analytics, then use a table. But if you need it for layout purposes, steer away from it.
Right. If I just want to put 3 logos on the middle of my page, don't use a table to do that.
Yes, there's.
Raf, are there other ways to do that sort of stuff layout-wise?
Yeah, so tables came about as a remnant of when people were still kind of fleshing out design with HTML and CSS.
Mm-hmm.
So they've kind of stuck around because they were necessary back then. But now we have CSS Flexbox, CSS Grid. You can even simulate tables with CSS using display table. So now you have way more options that are better suited for layout purposes,
Mm-hmm.
and tables should be for data only, really.
Excellent point. You want to make sure your page does not contain repeatedly flashing images. Check to make sure the page does not contain a strobe effect. Ref, what kind of elements could cause such an effect, and how much is too much, would you say?
So things that do that on a website are typically videos that autoplay, carousels that auto-rotate, or GIFs, anything that flashes.
Sure.
So the limitations are it has to be 3 or less flashes a second, or less than 25 degrees, 25% of 10 degrees of the visual field.
Oh, okay.
So what that means, it's a mouthful, but what that means is basically the central area of vision in the eye.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are going to have something that flashes more than 3 times, it has to be relatively small. So that'll depend on screen size, the size of your website. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. But the point is that it has to be, probably 1/8 of your website. Yeah.
Amanda, do you address these concerns with clients who may want to have carousels on their sites and display 3 different offers in rotation?
Absolutely, and there are ways that you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned play pause buttons, so if there's controls where people can navigate through the carousel and it's not just rapidly flashing through, or if you have your main header image and then cross cells down below, you don't necessarily have to have them in a carousel. It's just a matter of looking at all of the important elements to the website, prioritizing them, and then coming up with the layout that works so that you don't have to have carousels.
Okay, so I think that's another example of accessibility being the best practice and leading you to a better solution to kind of putting all those promotions in the one spot on a carousel.
Absolutely. There's no need to have, all 27 of your offers rapidly flying through your website.
Right. And I think people have shown that no one, statistics, no one actually sits there and watches it. So it's kind of a waste at that point.
I saw some statistic where it's 90% clicks on the first one, and then it's a drop off to like 0.00% for
so anything
for
else
other
is lost
carousels.
anyway.
Yeah.
So ditch your carousels.
Whether or not it's an accessibility issue. Yeah. A link is provided to disability accessible page where a plugin can be downloaded. When form controls or text input fields use the label element. Tracy, could you explain what the label element is?
Certainly. So when you're looking at a form, you will see like input fields, which is where you'll input the data. The label to a screen reader basically tells them what to put in that box. So if you're missing those label tags, they're not going to know what to put in those input fields. And then the form controls are basically all of the radio buttons, input fields, text areas, check boxes on a page.
I think forms have come up a few times. We've touched on different elements of it, and I think as I think of myself using websites, I must fill out a dozen forms a day if I'm requesting information, or if I'm making a purchase, or I'm constantly filling out forms. I can only imagine what the barriers may be to somebody with trying to access forms via a screen reader. I often have troubles too. And, there will be fields that may be required that didn't initially say they were required. So I think it's a critical item to look at if you're doing business on your website, is to examine whether or not your forms are working as they should.
Absolutely. Otherwise, they're going to be barricaded. They're not going to know. They're not going to be able to get their information to you. They're not going to be able to receive products and services.
Right. It's almost like maybe you've put in place some accessibility features and you can navigate the site, but if that form is not accessible, then it's almost like you're stopping somebody at the checkout that can't finalize their purchases. Yeah. So let's move on to the last few of these. When text is not available, use the title attribute. Include any special instructions within field labels. Make sure that form fields are in a logical tab order. Makes sense, as we were discussing there. And you want to include a skip navigation button to help those with text readers. Raf, what is a skip navigation button? How would that work?
So basically, it's a link that allows you to bypass large blocks of content, and it's required at the top of a page because screen readers have to announce every link in a menu. And as we know, WebTrend is to have all your main navigation at the top, and typically you have your menus, submenus, and submenus underneath that. So screen reader has to go through and announce all of those. And it's necessary for the first page, maybe the second one after that. But when they're looking for content and they're 3 pages deep, and your screen reader is announcing the same menu items over and over again, it's infuriating.
Sure. Yeah.
Or it's even kind of distracting. So skip navigation at the very top above that navigation, it allows you to just get straight to the content. So that way someone with a screen reader, as soon as they arrive on a new page, they can say, yes, I've heard the navigation options. I just want to read this article.
Excellent. So you can get right to the content that you were looking for. Excellent. Well, as we bring things to a close and head towards our Q&A portion, I just want to leave with this kind of closing thought. Accessibility overlaps with other best practices such as mobile web design, device independence, multimodal interaction, usability, design for older users, and search engine optimization, SEO. Thoughts, Amanda? You've touched upon this throughout. I think you've made this point several times, but if you wouldn't mind just reiterating, I think it's the strongest point here.
Sure. So, you talk about doing a new website and think about your priorities. You might think about mobile responsiveness or mobile first design and SEO and ADA and how you prioritize all of those things. But I think in reality, they're not priorities. They all work hand in hand. When you design your site for SEO best practices and mobile usability, you're also at the same time creating a site that's more likely to be up to ADA standards for accessibility. So I think they all, fortunately, really work well together, and they don't create competing priorities, but just one direction to move in when you're looking at a new web presence.
Excellent. And I think we've seen that they work together, and it's important to have someone like yourself who understands how they work, business objectives wise, but then having designers and developers like Raf and Tracy here who understand the accessibility and can, bring these items to life.
Absolutely. It takes the whole team to understand what you're trying to accomplish and what you need to do for the steps along the way to make sure that your website is accessible.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's move into a Q&A portion. Let's see if we received any questions along the way. As we're looking up the questions, I do have one, and this is just really to everyone out there. If I'm on the webinar today and I've left the webinar, I know bigger picture, I probably have to redesign my website, or I have to make some big steps. What step could I take today? What could I do today to start the process? Is there any recommendations that you have, Raf?
Sure. So I would definitely start to get acquainted with WCAG principles. Sure. It's true that they're not that easy to digest. There are, layman's terms versions of the WCAG. I would just look through them and just get a kind of an understanding of what it entails. You don't have to know them front to back, but just enough that you can kind of pick up on what might be an issue.
Yeah.
So kind of having that in the back of your mind, then evaluate your site from the new point of view of, maybe I'm differently abled, or I just can't use a mouse, or, I'm visually impaired in some way. How would someone access my website, my business, my service? And then put together a plan of action and say, maybe these items take priority because there's a huge issue. No one can access my forms. No one can buy my product.
Right.
So you would tackle that first. and then kind of start having an overview of your website. Maybe it's time for a redesign because everything needs an overhaul, or maybe you just need to tackle some smaller issues like the fact that you have a carousel or something.
Another question, I think this is more for Amanda and Paul. Many websites, when they launch ADA compliant, but end up with violations as users come in and push new content live. Perhaps they're forgetting to add the alt tag to an image that's part of a blog post. Or what recommendations do you have to maintain website compliance once you get to that mark?
Sure. So I think it starts with, as Raph said, familiarizing yourself with what those things are that you need to keep in mind. If you have really no familiarity with what WCAG is and what's required, it's really hard to try to maintain a website that lives up to those standards. The other thing that you can do is there's a lot of tools out there that will scan your site and flag things that are maybe issues. I know Moncito and SiteImprove are two of them. I'm sure there's plenty of others out there. So utilizing one of those tools to consistently keep an eye on your website and fix issues as they come up, so you don't end up a year down the road and all of a sudden you have 50 things that you have to go back through and redo when you just launched your website a year ago.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, Raph.
Oh, I was just going to say, scanning your own website is, there's a lot of free tools online, like Amanda said, but you can also kind of go out and hire someone to do an ADA audit for you, and they can give you kind of a point by point, principle by principle evaluation of where you stand. If you feel that maybe you're not equipped to look at your site for accessibility issues, you can certainly go to a third party and have them do that for you.
Sure.
I just want to add on, that's a great point. We do run into issues with clients where they receive the scan from their third party, but the scan's not a human. So it might be flagging issues that really aren't an issue that just need to be sort of zeroed out, if you will. So when you get the scan, it can look really intimidating. Say, oh my gosh, I have
they don't know how to read it.
Thousands of things to do. But it could just be that your logo is creating an error, but it's on every page. So it's a quick, simple fix, or maybe just a false positive. But you don't know that if you're just taking the scan at face value.
Sure. So it kind of goes back to, you have to kind of know.
Yes, and
know the
working with
guidelines.
a partner that understands it, I think, can be so beneficial.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one other thing to do is obviously make sure that you have one person or a small group of people who are responsible for deploying content and maintaining the website.
Right.
The website is open to too many people who can do what they feel like doing to the site. That just means that people may be adding things that are going to make the site non-compliant.
Yep. Yeah.
From an ADA and a security perspective.
Yes.
So I do have a few questions here. Let's start at the top. Rick has asked us, and this one I think for Paul here, do you think the Department of Justice, the DOJ, will give lead time to implement if these guidelines ever do come to fruition?
I'm not sure about that. I would imagine they would, because most of the time there is some lead time.
Yeah.
I think at this point, though, waiting for the Department of Justice is probably going to be a mistake.
Yeah.
I think we now have enough guidance with the various district court rulings and superior court rulings in multiple states that indicates that the level 2 standards are going to be the ones going to do the implementation anyway. So I would imagine the best thing to do is just get ahead of it rather than waiting for the Department of Justice to actually come up with a formal guideline.
Yeah, this is essentially our lead time, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't, from what we've seen in the cases, there's level AA guidelines, the WCAG 2.0, they seem to be best practices. And if you were at that level and they put forth new guidelines that maybe said, there were other items to be addressed, I think if you were achieving that, wouldn't be a far step to take to whatever those guidelines may be. But,
that's correct.
So we have another question now from Patricia. Patricia asks, are we responsible for third-party content on a bank website, i.e. like a mortgage bot? Any thoughts there?
Sure. So unfortunately, you have no control over third-party content. If we're speaking specific to financial institutions, that's why you have a speed bump.
Yeah.
When you're leaving from the bank website to go to a third-party
Yeah, we're
website,
making very clear that
to say this is not content or website that we control. We have no really say over what's happening on their site. I think a lot of the third parties are aware of ADA, and there are certainly some specific to financial institutions out there that are considering ADA. They're working towards or have already made their platforms compliant. But I would love to hear everyone else's opinions. In my mind, you have no control over it, so you really can't be held responsible for that third party content as long as you have that speed bump.
Right.
That's accurate. Yeah.
But so if the content is actually embedded on your website, then it kind of gets into a little bit of a tricky scenario, because if it's on your domain, the end user might not view it as such. I mean, it's on your website, kind of like similar to videos.
The video issue, yes. That's what I'm
right? So
thinking,
you're semi-responsible for making sure that is WCAG compliant.
And she had asked about MortgageBot in particular, and I'm assuming that's something that's embedded on your website that would have you fill out a form like, this is the type of house that I can afford, these are the payments, and it probably spits back a response or something along those lines. So it's almost like a form embedded on your site.
Yeah, so with MortgageBot right now, I don't believe they have any embed features.
Okay.
So you would actually be okay in this instance, because you'd be speed bumping out to their website, and then any functionality be back onto that vendor.
Back onto them. So yeah, like the video.
I think it is a two-part response. First of all, from a legal point of view, make sure your terms of use and policies on your website are very clearly indicating that is what's happening.
Yeah.
So obviously somebody is leaving, they know they're leaving, but again, I think to cover yourself, again, you need to indicate that you have no control over when you leave the site. And the most common thing is the choice of whether to use PDF documents or whether to link to another site for purposes of making an announcement.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best practice is to link to the other site rather than try and do a PDF.
And then I just kind of want to wrap all this up by saying you can claim partial compliance. Typically, this is kind of a statement that WCAG says you can put at the bottom of your site, where you can say, we comply up until this point, and we don't for this particular issue because of etc. So you should be trying to basically achieve as much compliance as you can, but sometimes even WCAG acknowledges that third-party content is out of your control. So at that point on that particular page, on that point in time, you can say we are only partially compliant today.
Mm-hmm. I think the goal too would be going forward, as you're maybe exploring new vendors, third parties that you might want to work with, is to ask that accessibility question up front, and I think they will head that way. I think the mortgage bots and will, they're aware, like you said, Amanda, so they know too that they have to be ADA compliant.
Absolutely, and we've seen a mixture of responses from a variety of types of vendors, not even just online loan applications. And some are aware and they're actively working towards it, or have already done so, and some are aware and have said we're not going to really do anything right now.
Yeah.
So then it's a decision on how you want to handle that.
Who you want to work with and how you want to handle that. Catherine asks, and this will be to our Pannos marketing team, and obviously SilverTech has experience working with banks, but any considerations for banks specifically when it comes to ADA compliance? I suppose beyond what we've spoken generally to ADA compliance for any website. Thoughts on banks specifically, Amanda?
I don't think that for banks specifically, it's really any different. It's looking at all of the content on your website. You maybe might have more forms than some other businesses with online loan applications and online account opening. But again, they're likely through third parties, so you probably don't have a whole lot of control over them. Same thing with like your online banking. Whoever your core processor is, your core provider, they're going to control what that experience looks like. So it's something to keep in mind, but it might not be something that you really have a whole lot of say in what that is and what the accessibility is of it. Tracy, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, because I think a lot of the functionality, like with the online loan applications, like the heavy lifting is on the vendor. But I think it is, I think we've all touched on this, it's just to bring a sense of awareness to the user experience on your website to make it easier to get to the products and services they're looking for. Because otherwise you're barricading them. One
thing I do think is that banking establishments' websites, they tend to have more forms, and error validation is very important for ADA and WCAG. So there are more guidelines around that, such as you need to very clearly indicate the desired format, required fields.
Yep.
If they make an error, you need to specifically point out where and how to fix it. So again, because banks tend to have a little bit more of that, I would say that's definitely something to watch out for. Make sure you have a very robust and clear error validation.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Patricia also asks, when's the deadline for our website to be ADA compliant? Paul, thoughts on when the deadline is?
There is no deadline at the moment because the Department of Justice guidelines haven't been adopted. I guess my feeling would be obviously rolling the dice is probably not the best choice.
Sure.
Only because you never know when you might get the letter indicating that you're not compliant. And I think if you're in a position where you're thinking about doing a rebuild of your site, I think the best thing is to do it being ADA compliant. It's easier to do it now than it is to go in and have to fix it later.
Right, right.
So I guess that would be my answer to that. No, there's no specific time frame that you have to have it done by, other than the fact that it probably should be done as soon as you can do it.
Yeah. We've made the analogy earlier to having a wheelchair ramp on your building. Much easier to, if you're building a new building, to plan where that wheelchair ramp is going to be and how it's going to be accessible, rather than building your building and then going back and trying to make it accessible. I think if you're building a new website this year, it makes a lot of sense to think about those accessibility features right off the bat, instead of building a website and going back and trying to retrofit those on.
Yeah, I think the incremental increase to making it compliant is not sufficient to not do it.
Sure.
As opposed to deciding you're going to roll the dice and then having to go back and fix it under the threat of a potential litigation situation.
Right. And as we've talked, it overlaps with SEO. You wouldn't, if we told you that here was a trick to, make your site search engine optimal, you wouldn't say no to that,
Right, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. Do we have Jen asks us, what's the standard WCAG policy on links that open in a new window?
So typically they recommend that you stay within the same window, that you open in, the same frame. They do want you to announce via alt tags if you're going to open in a new target.
Okay.
So they want you to say, here's a link to, etc., opens in a new window.
Okay.
So there's no, you can do it. That's fine. Just make sure that your accompanying code and alt tags account for that.
Yeah. So it's kind of giving that indication that you're being taken to a new window, taking elsewhere. And
Exactly.
if that was a third party, particularly for a bank, they'd want to have that kind of disclosure too, that's presented to you to let you know that you're headed off site.
Yeah.
Any online tools that can check? I know we mentioned a few. If we could just recap some of those. I know I have a couple I use. Raf, a couple of tools that you use to check.
Yeah. I don't want to dominate.
No,
I definitely get this question a lot.
Yeah.
I use Site Improve. I really like because it's very understandable. So you can buy, I think it's a subscription of some sort, but you can buy the tool where you can scan your whole website and it will give you a report. Or there's a free version, which is a browser extension. So you can go page by page and it will actually list out the errors for you. I recommend that one just because it's a lot easier to digest for someone who's maybe not familiar. It'll actually tell you what guidelines, something may fail and what you specifically have to do to fix them. So Site Improve is one. I also use HTML Code Sniffer.
Okay.
Again, that's a page-by-page browser extension, so it's not going to run a scan through your whole site. You have to go in individually, but it's also good at pointing out individual places on your site and what you need to do to fix it. I've also seen Axe Accessibility,
Yeah, that's one I've used. Yeah.
That one's good. It goes into the actual source code. It goes into the web inspector. So it'll tell you the specific line of code that you need to fix. So that's a little more on the development side. And then you can use just like the WebAIM, AIM code validator. Tracy,
Yeah.
use?
And I think that, so I've used pretty much all of those. And then also too, there's the Wave tool, which I think is through WAIM, which is a browser extension. And the one great thing that these tools do is it actually really breaks it down for you in layman's terms as to how to fix your website, versus if you've ever gone and read the WCAG website, it's very, very hard to understand and to, get a grip on what needs to be fixed. But these actually will break it down for you. They'll give you examples of how to fix it. Even so, giving you examples of what's unacceptable versus what will pass.
Nice. So I think one of the points we've made earlier is, to familiarize yourself with the ADA and these guidelines. Perhaps that great first step that you take after today's webinar would be to get a free browser extension and just do a quick check. Just run an analysis with that Wave tool and see what it comes back as, and start to learn what you have to fix and what you have to improve as you go. And I think that brings us to a conclusion here. Gone through all the questions. Again, if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to us. Again, this is a joint webinar from SilverTech and from Pannos Marketing. We will follow up with the presentation, as I said, and an on-demand copy of the video. I want to thank my panelists. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Raf.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you for joining us. And Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
We will sign off now, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you had an informative webinar. Take care.